Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to Lecture 12 for Logic. Our aim here is to talk a little bit about ontological commitment. So I want to start by, again, stressing what we're really going to cover in this lecture and the next one. Our aim here is to not so much focus on the formal systems, as we have been up until this point, but really think about what the consequences are for adopting certain formal systems, or the kind of philosophical upshots of some of the tools that we've developed. And what we're going to talk about today is one particular theoretical upshot. So the plan is to start by talking about what we'll jokingly call some commitment issues. And this is actually going to be three very tightly bound up kind of questions or problems that might come up when we're thinking about theory selection or generally about what kind of view of the world we want to adopt. So we'll start by kind of setting the stage and motivating why we might be interested in the later questions. Then we'll have a little aside where we'll talk a little bit about misleading language and a notion of paraphrase. Now this is something we've already done quite a bit of early on, but it's just again helpful to kind of remind ourselves. This will set us up for section 3, where we're going to talk about Quine's method for determining ontological commitment. So here we'll talk particularly about a view developed by W.V.O. Quine and how that kind of gives us a way to answer some of the commitment issues we talked about in section 1. Then we'll move on to what we'll call the paraphrase strategy. And this is something that someone who's been challenged as an ontological cheater, something we'll define in Quine's method, an ontological cheater might offer as a way to kind of dodge or avoid being called a cheater. This will then set us up to talk about some kind of lurking issues with Quine's method and this paraphrase strategy. So that's the plan. Again, it's going to be kind of motivate the dialectic here, a little aside talking about misleading language and paraphrase, and then diving straight into a way to think about ontological commitment. But first, let's think about some commitment issues. So, if we go way back and think about when we were introduced to first-order logic, when we were discussing FOL symbolization, we were almost always given a domain, right? If you remember, there was a domain, and this domain was something like the kind of collection of things that we're talking about. And being told the contents of a domain was extremely useful because it helped determine what kinds of things actually mattered about being in the extension or not being in the extension of the predicates. It fixed what was picked out by the relevant names. And probably most importantly, it kind of settled what the quantifiers ranged over. If we're thinking metaphorically, the domain is sort of like the stuff that's inside the big glass container, right? And then our quantifiers are something like cranes in a crane game. So they can reach in and they could grab one thing, or they might reach in and they could grab every single thing and pull them out of our little domain box. So again, domains, really important. Most of the time when we were dealing with FOL, we were given domains. It was already specified for us. But of course, you might ask, well, what happens if we're doing FOL or something like this, and we're not given a domain? I mean, you've already seen this, you've done this. This is what you were asked to do when you had to construct interpretations. You had to come up with your own domain. But that's not the only way you might get to something like that. You might actually work backwards. That is, you might take some FOL sentences and then kind of figure out what needs to be in the domain, or what should be in the domain, in order for the sentences to be true or false. Again, this was the kind of thing that you were doing when you were constructing interpretations. You'd figure out what needs to be in the domain for existentials, for universals, for certain name sentences to be true or false. So this already highlights one kind of interesting thing, right? We can sometimes go from sentences to figure out what the domain is. Again, this working backwards idea. The structure of the sentences can help us figure out the domain. So that's one kind of interesting issue. Now here's a related but distinct issue. Sometimes, in fact frequently, we're going to need to pick between competing theories. Now these theories might be scientific, they might be philosophical, they might be ethical, they might be any one of 100,000 things. And we're needing to pick, like, hey, should we believe in this theory or should we believe in that theory? And, right, we might think about, well, different ways to kind of sort this out. What kind of criteria might we have for theory choice? And one aspect we might invoke here as a way to kind of weigh up for one side versus the other is in terms of what we'll call ontological simplicity. That is, we can ask, right, what does this theory say is out in the world? What kinds of things have to exist for this theory to be true? In contrast, what kind of things need to exist for that theory to be true? In this way, what we're doing is we're settling the ontological commitments of a theory. What do the theories say exists? What has to be there for the relevant theories to be true? And by settling the ontological commitments, we can then figure out, hey, which theory do we like as ontologically simpler? That is, which theory kind of commits us to postulating fewer fundamental or unexplained entities? Now, this is obviously not the only kind of criterion for evaluating between theory choice, but it's a useful one. Right? A theory that postulates extra or a plentitude of redundant entities seems much worse than one that only needs these sorts of things and can do the job with a subset of the ones in the plentitude. So again, our first one, we have this sort of issue about reverse engineering a domain. Our second issue here is something like comparing theories, and one aspect of comparison could be the ontological commitments. What do the things say exist? And the last kind of issue is very closely related. Right? But before that, we can quickly talk about some examples. So here's a particular theory, plate tectonic theory. Right? I almost said platonic. We're going to come to that in a couple slides. So plate tectonic theory. It's postulated to explain things like the existence of mountains, the behavior of volcanoes, why there are earthquakes, and why they happen in certain locations. And the theory postulates that the Earth's outermost layer is made up of these big rocky plates, which sit on top of a partially molten layer, and then kind of drift around and run into each other and subside under each other. And it's the interaction of these plates, these moving around and bumping into each other, that's responsible for things like mountains forming, earthquakes happening, for volcanoes erupting. So this kind of theory postulates certain entities, tectonic plates, a molten layer, volcanoes, mountain ranges, and things. Right? And in that sense, it's ontologically committed to things like plates, molten layer, volcanoes, mountain ranges. It postulates the plates to explain the existence and behavior of the sort of everyday things that we run into. Like, well, not here. We don't really run into mountain ranges and volcanoes, but we in a very big, broad sense. Another example, we can think of, in this case, a failed theory. So Leverrier came up with this idea of Vulcan. He was trying to explain why Mercury seemed to sometimes go into retrograde. So it would orbit the sun, as we're observing it, and then seemingly would sometimes sort of back up and go forward and back up and go forward. And his explanation, like his postulation, was that there was an intermercury planet. That is, there was a planet he called Vulcan, as you can see it here, that existed in between the sun and Mercury, and it was Vulcan's kind of moving around the sun that affected how Mercury was seemingly moving relative to Earth. So this theory is, again, got a phenomenon that's trying to explain, and it's explaining it at least partially by postulating, supposing there exist some entities, in this case, Vulcan. So the theory is ontologically committed to things like the sun, to Mercury, and of course, the reason why the theory fails, to a planet called Vulcan, which just simply turned out to not be there. Finally, a last kind of example that you guys will be familiar with from some of your other courses. Right? We might postulate what are often called Platonic universals. So these are properties that are, in some sense, multiply instantiated around the world. So we can call, we've got this stack of cups, let's call this cup toppy, or top, and let's call this cup bottom, or bottom. right? We can say top is blue, and we can say bottom is blue, so it seems natural to then go from there and say there's something that top is that bottom is too, namely blue. But note, by saying that there is something, we seem to be suggesting that there really is something, there exists something out in the world that's shared by top and bottom. And that's going to be some kind of universal, the property of being blue, of blueness. So the theory then is going to be committed to the existence of blue. Okay, again, just some sort of examples to kind of think about the ontological commitments of a theory. Let's spool back. So we had our first issue, which was again kind of reverse engineering a domain from some sentences. Our second one, really closely related, but not quite the same, of comparing theories in terms of their kind of ontological requirements. What sort of things do they say have to be out there? And our last big issue that we might be interested in is the general project of ontology. This I suspect you've run into in other classes, but ontology we can roughly characterize as something like the study of being, or the study or question of what there is, what exists, what sort of things are out there in the world. And ontology, of course, has a long and complicated history, as I'm sure you've talked about in some of your other courses. But the big issue, at least one big issue here, is that there doesn't seem to be any genuinely or generally accepted way to settle ontological questions. Maybe even knowing what exactly the ontological questions really are. But there is one obvious way to understand this project or to understand ontological questions. We can understand them as asking, what is there? What sorts of things are out there in the world? Or perhaps putting it in terms that we've already used, what are the ontological commitments of the perfect, complete theory of the world? Now note, this doesn't have to be a theory that any of us actually believe, or that any of us have ever written down or will ever write down. We're just kind of saying, suppose there was something like a book of the world that perfectly described everything in the most accurate terms. What would be the ontological commitments of the theory laid out in that book of the world? This would then give us a way to answer, or at least approach answering, ontology. It would be the things that that book of the world theory, the complete, total, perfect theory, would be committed to. Now, of course, there's a lot of work to be done in figuring that out, but at least it starts to give us a grip on how to think about ontology as a science and ontological questions as philosophical questions. So again, 3 kinds of things, all of which center around this issue of figuring out what sort of things, what kind of objects, theories, or sentences are committed to. This is really what we're interested in when we think about ontological commitment. Now, before we come back to ontological commitment, a quick segue to talk about misleading language and paraphrase. And here we'll get to have some fun and talk a little bit about Alice in Wonderland. So, here's something blatantly obvious, shouldn't really need repeating, but I will anyway. The surface grammar of natural language sentences often don't indicate the sentence's underlying logical structure. If you want an easy one, just think about how confusing A only if B is. The underlying structure here, the actual logical structure of the sentence, and the kind of surface grammar pull almost in different directions. And you can get this sort of point even stronger by thinking about a sort of jokey example from Lewis Carroll. So, Alice says, I see nobody in the road. And then you have, I only wish I had such eyes, the king remarked in a fretful tone, to be able to see nobody, and at this distance, too. Now, obviously, in this case, right, the king is making a kind of, we'll call it witty, being very charitable, a witty pun, right? Alice's claim doesn't use the word nobody as a subject, right? Or at least not strictly. It's something like a direct object. But the way King reads it is that he's reading nobody as a name. So he's saying, oh, Alice is seeing someone. Who is the someone? It's someone named nobody. Those of you who are familiar with the Odyssey will also know another very good example of this, with Odysseus talking to Polyphemus. Right? But there's even a more flat-footed example which we've run across earlier. Russell gave it to us way back when we were talking about definite descriptions. So the present King of France is bald. Read, at least flat-footedly, this suggests something like a subject-predicate form, where the subject is the present King of France, and the predicate is bald. But of course, this kind of reading of that English sentence quickly leads to trouble, because the lack of a present King of France suggests that the sentence somehow misfires. And that seems to kind of undermine the principle of bivalence. That is, it turns out that the present King of France is bald is false, but so is the present King of France is not bald, at least if you read it the same way. Right? So that's bad. That's not a good thing. Now, Russell, of course, gives us an easy way out. He says, look, you're being misled by the surface structure of the English, right? If you actually re-express the sentence in something like a formal language, you will better lay bare its actual form. Because instead of, to go back a slide, instead of the present King of France is bald, what this sentence really says is that there's exactly one thing that is a present King of France. There's at least one and at most one, and it's the present king. Right? And that thing that we were just talking about, it's bald. And understood that way, it's no problem that the sentence comes out false, because the there is clause right at the beginning fails. So re-understanding or re-expressing a natural language sentence in a more formalized way draws out the underlying logical form, and it can clarify what's actually being said. And of course, we can pull the same trick with the exchange between Alice and the White King. Alice's initial claim of "I see nobody on the road," right, can be easily and readily re-expressed in a slightly more formal, albeit much more stilted way. Is not the case that there is something that I see on the road. Or if you don't like something, we can do it as someone. Right? In this case, there's no subject term nobody for the king to make a pun off of. Right? There is no use of nobody. There's a much more explicit kind of negation and sentential form. So it just sort of stops the king's misunderstanding or his hilarious joke, right? But of course, right, this kind of re-expression can really be useful, and it will often be very helpful in expressing or capturing the underlying structure of a given claim by making it explicit. And this is basically what we were doing in the first half when we were doing things like symbolization practice. We were trying to capture the underlying logical expressions or logical form of some natural language sentences. Now, we're going to come back to this point later, because you'll note that this all is very clear when we're playing with things like Alice's use of "I see nobody." But what happens when we have English sentences that permit several different re-expressions or paraphrases into a formal language? Which one should we prefer? Now, this is going to be a point that we're going to use when we come back and think about ontological commitments. Okay, so that's our little aside. Let's come back now and think about Quine's method. So here we want to return back to the 3 points we talked about in section 1. So we had 3 kind of issues. There's the general issue of working backwards from some collection of sentences to something like what needs to be in the domain. There's a second kind of thing where we're trying to do something like theory comparisons in terms of what objects they're committed to allow us to kind of pick the one that we think is ontologically simpler. And then there's the broad question of understanding debates about ontology and how we might even understand ontological questions. And Quine's method gives us a way to start approaching every single one of these. So, let's talk about Quine's method. Willard V.O. Quine, that's him right here, with a beautiful little modal logical formula ducked behind him, right? he proposed the general method for settling our commitment issues. And he started off with basically two questions. Right? So this is in his On What There Is paper. And he started off by asking, look, how do we tell the commitments of a given theory, and how do we do ontology? Our earlier commitment issues. Right? And he says, look, according to Quine, whose views on commitment are fine, right? Ontology is about what there is. As he puts it, a curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? Right? And he also says the answer is easy. Right? It can be answered, moreover, in one word. Everything! Right? And everyone will accept this answer as true. But of course, this isn't the real answer because, as he jokingly says, there remains room for disagreement over cases. What's in the everything? So, we can unpack this a little bit more. Quine says, okay, ontology, it's really about trying to figure out what exists. What is there? Right? And he's going to give us a method that's designed explicitly to help us catch what he calls ontological cheaters. Ontological cheaters are either individuals who adopt theories or theories that are in fact ontologically committed to certain entities, despite professing that said entities don't exist. As he puts it, it's philosophical double talk, which would repudiate an ontology while simultaneously enjoying its benefits. So the thought here is that an ontological cheater is someone who says something like, hey, look, mugs don't exist. And then goes on to commit themselves to something like, thank God for this beautiful mug, which holds my coffee. So if I say mugs don't exist, and then also commit my theory to this mug holds my coffee, right, I'm cheating. I'm ontologically cheating, professing that certain entities don't exist, while my theory in fact requires them to be out there. I turn out to be committed to them. So these are ontological cheaters. How do we catch them? Well, we catch them with this. So our background idea is that existence, what it means to be, the is of existence, isn't going to be a predicate, but it's instead going to be expressed via our existential quantifier. So if we wanted to say Alfred's human, right, using FOL, we might have H as the predicate is human, and little a stands for Alfred, but we could then read Alfred exists, not as, E, little a, but as there exists an X such that X is identical to Alfred. So to exist is somehow going to be expressed by our quantifier. And that's obviously going to be bound up with catching cheaters, because cheaters say something doesn't exist and then end up being committed to it after all. So when does a theory or an individual commit themselves to something? When do they say something exists? Well, we'll just read the Quine quote. He says, we can very easily involve ourselves in ontological commitments by saying, for example, that there is something which red houses and sunsets have in common, or that there is something which is a prime number larger than 1,000,000. But this is essentially the only way we can involve ourselves in ontological commitments, by our use of bound variables. To be assumed as an entity is, purely and simply, to be reckoned as the value of a variable. Or, put another way, to be is to be the value of a bound variable. So what does this actually mean? It means that the existence of an object, the ontological commitment to an object, is to be committed to the truth of an existentially bound sentence where that object needs to be the entity plugged in for the variable. To go back a slide, this sentence where we have this kind of existential and we have the existentially bound variable, this sentence is ontologically committed to Alfred, because Alfred is the only object that we could slot in there for that bound variable that will make this sentence true. So what is it to be ontologically committed, either as a theory or as an individual? It's to be committed to an existentially quantified sentence where that object has to be the value of the existentially quantified variable. Now you might ask, right, why use the existential quantifier? Why not names? There's three reasons. One is particularly Quinian. Quine thought, actually, we don't really need names, at least not proper names. We could instead, every time we think we have a proper name, replace it with a definite description. Now, this is an interesting view. It's an idea. But there's kind of more interesting reasons generally as to why to avoid ontological commitment by a naming. The second reason is that, look, you can clearly be committed to things despite not having named them, right? An easy example, plate tectonic theory didn't give names for the plates, but it definitely was committed to them, right? It said there are these things that are plates that sit on top of a molten layer, right? It didn't say, here's Steve and Jerry and Tom and Harry, and these are the different plates. It just told you, hey, there are plates. So you can clearly commit yourself to something despite not having names for them. And on the flip side, much as there might be entities in the domain without names, there might be multiple names for the same entity. Right? That is, we might have Steve, Tom, Jerry, etc., and it turns out really we're only going to be committed to just one. Right? So, again, we can be committed to things that are, even if we don't have names for them, and we can clearly be committed to something even if it turns out we have multiple names for the same object. So, again, Quine's view is that one is ontologically committed to things if and only if your theory either entails or includes an existential sentence where the objects have to be the value of the existentially bound variable. So what then are ontological cheaters? Ontological cheaters, because remember, Quine's method is designed to catch them. Ontological cheaters are theorists or theories who deny the existence of Fs. They assert it's not the case that there exists some Fs, but their theory turns out to be committed to the truth of a sentence that entails there are some Fs. So this gives us a general way also of doing ontological commitments. So here is Quine's method. We take the sentences that a given theory takes to be true. Take all of them, list them off. These are probably going to be expressed in some kind of natural language. So our second step is to take the sentences the theory says are true and regiment them into what Quine calls canonical notation. The idea here is that what we're going to do is re-express the sentences into some kind of formal language. And by doing this, and regimenting the sentences, we're going to capture and express the underlying logical, quantificational structure that the sentences implicitly have. Once we then have our regimented theory, or regimented collection of all the sentences a theory says are true, we read off from what these theories are quantifying over to see what entities are required. And the theory then will be committed to all and only those entities that have to stand in the place of the existentials. Were the sentences we started with true? So again, it's fairly straightforward. We take the sentences that theory buys into, we regiment them into some kind of canonical notation, some kind of formal language. We then read off what things are being quantified over, and those are the ontological commitments of the theory. It's notable that regimentation is an essential part of Quine's method because, right, the implications and entailments and even the logical structure of a theory's claims are often obscured by how it's presented in natural language. And by moving to a formal language, by doing this regimentation, the commitments, the entailments, the actual structure is laid bare. So you get a kind of test case, right? We can go back to Leverrier-Bolkin, right? He said something like, hey, Venus causes Mercury's retrograde motion. Now we can regiment this into something along these lines, right? There's an X, there's a Y. X Venusizes, Y Mercurizes, and X's motion causes Y. Again, this is just a cheap and cheery kind of example. Notably, if we're really following this, we're going to have to understand things like retrograde motion. We'll have to really stretch out this causal notation. But again, this kind of gives us away. It starts to make clear what kinds of things this theory has to be committed to. It's going to need something that vulcanizes. It's going to need something that mercurizes. It's going to need some causation going on. Importantly, this kind of draws out what it would be. We could do the same thing with Alice's claim from earlier, right? The logical structure of Alice's claim doesn't involve commitment to there being nobody. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Alice's commitments are that it's not the case that there is somebody. Right? So there isn't any entity that is nobody. So the king's whole joke just falls flat, if it ever really worked in the first place, but we'll let that slide. So again, Quine's method, to go back, Quine's method is threefold. We settle the sentences that a theory takes to be true. We regiment those sentences into a kind of canonical notation, some sort of logical notation that lays bare the quantificational structure. And then we read off from those canonical notation sentences what kind of entities need to be in the domain. That will be then the ontological commitments of the theory. What is it existentially quantifying over? Those are the ontological commitments. So this gives us Quine's method. And Quine's method can let us do several things. We can catch cheaters. We catch cheaters by sussing out what their theory is committed to, and then seeing that, hey, their theory involves saying it's not the case that there exists some Fs, and they're being ontologically committed to Fs. So that's one thing. It also obviously lets us address our earlier worries. We can work backwards. That's a key part of Quine's method. In fact, that's exactly what step 3 is. It is this working backwards. We can compare and contrast theories in terms of their ontological commitments. We can figure out the commitments of this theory. We can figure out the commitments of that theory. And then we can see, hey, which one has fewer commitments? Which one has stuff that we find more plausible? And finally, we can come back to this big question of how to do ontology. Well, if we buy into this methodology, ontology or ontological questions will be settled in some way by thinking about, hey, are the best theories that we buy into, the best theories of the world, committed to these sorts of things? Well, if so, we should probably postulate them as part of the ontology of the world. So it gives us ways to come back to our opening commitment issues and start to address them. So there we go. That's Quine's method. Now, what we want to do next is turn to think about the paraphrase strategy. The paraphrase strategy is a kind of response to Quine's method. It's a tool that cheaters can use, but also non-cheaters, someone who doesn't kind of like the results they get. And in order to kind of run up to the paraphrase strategy, we can remind ourselves of Quine's method, right? Because the core part of Quine's method is regimentation, taking the natural language sentences and converting them into some kind of canonical formal notation. Well, of course, an issue here is how exactly do we do the regimentation? Because surface level grammar is often misleading about how a theory's actual logical structure is, how a sentence's logical structure is. This suggests something we can do. If you've got some sentence or some collection of sentences, and they prima facie commit you to something you don't want in your ontology, then you can paraphrase the sentences so as to dodge the apparent commitment. Now remember, we talked a little bit about paraphrase in the first half of the course. Paraphrase here means to keep the same meaning while just changing the surface structure. So you can kind of see a cheap example of this by thinking about, for heaven's sakes, don't do that. Now, if you just read the surface grammar of this sentence, it seems to be committed to sakes. In fact, not just sakes, but heaven and heaven's having sakes, whatever the hell sakes are. But of course, that's just the kind of surface grammar appearance. What we really mean when we say something like this, right? Well, we mean, I strongly suggest you don't do that, right? Or even just, I suggest you don't do that. That is, we can paraphrase that sentence, the heaven's sake sentence, to one that very obviously does not bear any commitment to heaven, to sakes, to anything along those lines. So that's the kind of idea of paraphrase. Take a sentence, don't change the meaning, but change the structure so that it's no longer committed to the thing it seemingly was committed to. This is the paraphrase strategy. Now, it's notable that the paraphrase strategy is limited in that whatever paraphrase you give has to have the same truth conditions. What we mean by that is the paraphrased sentence has to be true if and only if the original sentence that you're paraphrasing is true. So this means that really the strategy can only kind of go so far, right? You can't just wildly reinterpret sentences or map things entirely differently. You have to preserve tautological or logical equivalence. And notably, this paraphrase strategy only goes so far also in the sense that it can't get rid of all commitments. We are going to have to eventually quantify over some things. But it does seemingly offer a way around some potentially problematic cases. Heaven's sake, hey, there's multiple ways to get there, sounds a lot like it's committing to things that are ways rather than, roads or paths or something different. And it's useful to kind of see some examples here. So what we'll do, we'll talk about 3 examples to get a grip on how Quine's method works and how the paraphrase strategy can be used to kind of rebut or resist charges of being an ontological cheater. So our first one is an example from a kind of fun dialogue between Steffi Lewis and David Lewis in the early 80s. It's originally published in the late 60s, but they republished it in 1986. So we have a dialogue here between Argyle and Bargyle. And notably, David and Steffi Lewis both say, hey, it's not really clear who's Argyle and who's Bargyle. That's not the point. But we can kind of set that aside and put it in general terms. Suppose that one is a thoroughgoing materialist. So that is that you're committed to the idea that the only thing that exists are matter, material objects. Right? Material objects are the only thing that exists. So you don't believe in, as they put, intellectues or spirits or auras or deities or other things unknown to physics. You only like matter and how it's arranged. Okay, cool. So your theory only wants to commit to material objects, things that have mass and occupy space-time. Now, one interesting thing here is it looks like this theory will say that there are no such things as wholes, because wholes, by definition, don't have mass, though they might occupy space-time. Really, it's not even clear that they do that. It's rather that wholes would be places where things do not occupy space-time, but then they can't have mass. So you want to say there are no wholes. Problem. Our materialist, right, they live in the Netherlands, they eat a lot of cheese, so they're sitting there over their plate of cheese, and they say things like, hey, there are holes in this piece of cheese. And then we go, aha! We've caught you, you ontological cheater, because your theory commits you, or you want to say, there are no holes. But here's a sentence you take to be true. And this is very clearly ontologically committing to the existence of holes, because it says there are these things that are holes in this piece of cheese. So you're cheating. You're committed to the existence of holes, despite the fact that you said there are no such things as holes. What do you say about this, Mr. Physicalist, Mr. Materialist? Well, a materialist is in kind of a cheesy pickle. Right? They're committed to there are no holes, and also to there are holes in this piece of cheese. Something has to give. And this is already just kind of employing Quine's method to catch them. Now, to get around this issue, there's many things our materialists could do. They could give up on the idea that there are holes in this piece of cheese. They could accept that holes exist, and hey, it's the one exception to physical objects, right? To materialism, it's material objects and holes, right? Or they could re-understand there are holes in this piece of cheese. They could paraphrase that sentence to avoid quantifying over holes. For example, they might paraphrase there are holes in this piece of cheese as this piece of cheese is perforated. So this is only committal to cheese, and then it ascribes a predicate to that piece of cheese, namely being perforated. And there's no problem with committing to the existence of cheese. Cheese is material. So hey, by paraphrasing in this way, the materialist seemingly avoids the problematic commitment to holes, and hence to turning out to be an ontological cheater. Now we can kind of push this a little bit further, right? Because if the materialist is actually going to make this work, it's not just enough to give a kind of one-off paraphrase. They need to have a systematic paraphrase for all whole talk they take to be true. Because if there's even one holy sentence that can't be paraphrased away, they'll end up being committed to holes after all. There needs to just be even one instance where they say, inadvertently, there are holes, or their view entails there are holes, then they would still turn out to be cheaters. So what they need to do is find some way to systematically paraphrase. And they could kind of run with what we've already said, right? There's a hole in this piece of cheese, could be read as this cheese is perforated. There's a hexagonal hole in this piece of cheese, could be re-paraphrased as this piece of cheese is hexagonally perforated. We could also think about there are as many holes in my cheese as your cracker. Now this could be read as something like either both my piece of cheese and your cracker are singly perforated, or both are doubly perforated, or triply perforated. Notably, this kind of move is going to be ontologically neat and parsimonious. It's only going to commit to material objects. It's never going to be committed to the existence of holes. But of course, we're paying the price, this ontological simplicity. And we're paying the price for the ontological simplicity by increasing the complexity of our paraphrase. In order just to say, there are as many holes in my cheese as in your cracker, we're going to need effectively an infinitely long sentence. That's not so good. So, hey, we managed to not be ontological cheaters, but Jesus, what we thought this sentence said and what the materialist says are the cases, interesting. But you get the sense here, right? We apply the method, and it shows the materialist is seemingly a cheater, and then they can use the paraphrase strategy to try and work themselves out of it. So let's give another example, also from ontology. It's a funny example, but it's one that I have several friends who are really interested in. So let's think about tables, right? Tables and fundamental particles, quarks, leptons, things like this, right? Now, one fairly widely held view is a broad reductionism. A reductionist, an ontological reductionist, only wants to commit themselves to the existence of fundamental particles that physics tells us make up the very basic level. Right? So again, quarks, leptons, these kinds of things. What they don't want to do is they don't want to commit themselves to mugs, to tables, to sweaters, to human beings. Instead, it's just going to be little, teeny, tiny, super subatomic fundamental physical particles. Now, setting aside whatever they might want to say about holes and electricity and causation, it seems pretty clear that these guys are going to have a problem. Because in everyday speech, our reductionists say things, or seem to take true, talk of everyday objects. They might say something like, hey, this table is brown. Or this table has 4 legs. Right? And these sentences seem to require the existence of the table. Right? They seem to be ontologically committed to tables. So they face a problem. They look to be cheaters. How can they maintain their ontological reductionism while at the same time still buying into things like this table is brown or this table has 4 legs? Now, of course, they could just deny that these sentences are true, but that's going to end up really funny when you repossess their house. Right? When you take away the material objects they say don't exist, they're going to find some interesting things. My printer's getting in on the action here. It's excited. So again, our reductionist seems to face an interesting problem. How do they maintain their reductionism in light of their apparent commitments to things like these sentences being true? Well, what they do is offer a very careful, very select paraphrase. So this table is brown will actually be paraphrased down to there is a collection of fundamental particles arranged table-wise, and that collection appears brownishly. So again, we can sort of see how this generalizes. When confronted with apparent commitments to things like everyday objects, tables, chairs, mugs, human beings, our reductionist is going to paraphrase all of this talk into one that only quantifies over fundamental particles. This gives them an ontological way out, but it does so by postulating a bunch of very weird something 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 wise predicates. We're going to need mug wise predicates. We're going to need table wise predicates. We're going to need human being wise predicates. And this is very similar to the kind of thing we had earlier with our materialist and about wholes. Our reductionist is going to be forced into postulating a bunch of very strange predicates and doing a lot of paraphrase work. And note that they have to do a lot of paraphrase work, because if there's even one table sentence or even one sentence that they can't adequately paraphrase, then their whole process has failed and they will turn out to be ontological cheaters after all. So again, you have this method. Quine tells us, take their theory, read off what they're ontologically committed to. What do their existential claims range over? See if they explicitly commit themselves to denying the existence of something. If their theory turns out to be committed, they're a cheater. Cheaters can then use a paraphrase strategy to try and dodge the problem. But if there's even one sentence that kind of gets through, and they end up committed to the thing they explicitly say doesn't exist, they're still a cheater. They're still committing themselves to something that they want to say isn't there. One last kind of example, a fun one, something I'm really interested in. We can think about talk of fictional characters. So fictional characters are often taken to be paradigmatic non-existent objects. Poirot and Columbo, while wonderful characters, just don't exist. If you rounded up all of the detectives that ever were, you would not have Poirot and Columbo in that collection. Right? So this is a kind of intuitive, natural way to go. We might come back to that. Right? But then, right, if you deny the existence of fictional characters, we very quickly run into some issues. It seems natural to say Poirot is a detective, Columbo is a detective. Those sentences seem true, right? Contrast that with Columbo's a milkman, which is clearly false, right? There's no sense in which Columbo's a milkman, though there's a definite sense in which Columbo is a detective. Seems true. And of course, Columbo as a detective seems to prima facie involve commitment to Columbo. There is something that is Columbo, and that thing is a detective. So, what do we do? Well, we can quickly kind of for a paraphrase. And the paraphrase could be actually, right, Columbo as a detective isn't true. What's true is that according to the Columbo stories, or according to Agatha Christie's stories about Poirot, Poirot is the detective. This then only commits us to stories, which are things, you can point to a bookcase and see. Right? Or you can point to audio recordings or even just resonant sound waves to kind of get back to. So this is fine. Again, this gives us a way to apparently dodge commitments, right? we can still say fictional characters don't exist without having to deny that a sentence like Columbo is a detective turns out to be false, right? We can keep that true in some sense by paraphrasing it as according to the stories. This suggests the general paraphrase strategy for fictional character talk. We reread all the claims about the fictional character as actually being about the stories and say according to the stories, blah, 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 blah. Problem: doesn't seem to work for every kind of fictional character talk claim. Here are some that don't seem really plausible to be read in the way we just described. Right? Holmes is more famous than any living detective. That's not true according to the Holmes stories. That seems to be a claim about the real world, kind of mixing what's going on in the fiction, or what's true according to the fiction, with what's true. There's no obvious way to say according to some fiction here. Another example from Peter Van Inwagen: there are characters in some 19th century novels who are presented with greater wealth of physical detail than any character in any 18th century novel. Note that this has an explicitly quantificational structure. It says there are, and there are. So, again, this doesn't look like we can relativize it to some story. We can't say according to some 19th century novels, there are 18th century novel characters that are 19th century novel characters and more robust then. Doesn't really work. Another easy one: Schwarzenegger stronger than Frodo. That looks kind of true, but it's clearly not true according to The Lord of the Rings or anything like that, because Arnie, for all of his greatness, is just not really mentioned in those stories. So what kind of thing do we need to do here? Well, it seems that our everyday character talk commits us to the theoretical entities of literary criticism. It seems like we end up committed to fictional characters if we take these to be true. Now, of course, you might push back and say, no, right, we are going to find paraphrases for these, kind of muddle our way through. But again, we can start to see the problem. Quine's method, when applied to the commitments of, to go back a slide, our would-be fictional character denier, seems to say that they're cheaters. They're committed to the existence of these fictional characters, even though they profess to say that they don't exist. And whenever they try and use the paraphrase strategy to get out of commitment to characters, they walk into new problems, because there seem to be some sentences that they take to be true, which cannot be paraphrased, at least in the way that they suggested. Now again, this isn't kind of knocked down. The dance can continue. The fictional characters deniers can find out ways to paraphrase these, and then we might invent new sentences that they don't have good paraphrases for, and so on and so on. The important thing is that all of this going on here requires using something like Quine's method and the paraphrase strategy as kind of offsetting moves. So this gives us a kind of grip on the overarching background of how to use something like FOL to approach questions of ontology. Let's think about some kind of lurking issues here, and we'll wrap up with this bit. So Quine's method for understanding ontological commitment is powerful, useful, extremely simple, and just bought into by a lot of people. But of course, as with all philosophical things, there are some issues. And the first issue we can note actually comes out if you think about how we might regiment various sentences. Just take the following two sentences. We have sentence 1, some donuts have pink sprinkles, and all donuts have pink sprinkles. And if we think about how we regiment these into FOL, we end up with something very strange thinking about the ontological commitments. 1 is ontologically committing to donuts. 2 is not. And that's because 2 does not use an existential quantifier. 2 uses a universal quantifier. And 2 could be true vacuously. That is, it might be such that there are no donuts, in which case 2 would still be true, because it would have a universal quantifier in front, and then the main body would be a conditional. and the antecedent of the conditional would be false. So this shows us something after all. If we think about the kinds of sentences that make up many theories, if they turn out to be more like 2 than 1, it might be that sentences don't end up ontologically committing to things that they very explicitly want to be committed to, because they just don't include any existential quantifiers, but instead only universals. So this hits our first point. Quine's method only ascribes commitment via existential quantification, not universal. The second kind of lurking issue here comes back to something we were talking about earlier when we were thinking about things like our materialist and wholes, our reductionist and table talk. Right? When we were playing around there, I mentioned several times that, hey, they can give you a relatively simple ontology, but at the same time, they needed to make their notions of predicates extremely complex, very complicated, postulate a whole slew of different predicates. So, to put these in slightly more technical terms, we can say that there's two notions in the background here. There's the ontology of a theory, that is what things a given theory says there are, what it commits to. And then there is what we'll call the ideology of a theory. And this is something like the primitive predicates that the theory requires. Notably, we seem to be able to kind of pay for one in terms of the other. That is, we can postulate a very simple ontology, but in so doing, we're going to be forced into having incredibly complex ideology. Think about our materialist and their wholes. Materialist doesn't commit themselves to these weird things that are wholes, just things that have matter and space-time locations. But in order to make sense of all of this everyday talk, they have to then commit themselves to an obscenely weird ideology. They're going to have to give incredibly strange paraphrases, commit themselves to a bunch of very, very weird predicates. So that's kind of bad. On the flip side, you might have a very simple ideology, very few fundamental predicates, but a very complex ontology. That is, you postulate lots and lots and lots of things in order to kind of just read sentences as they're kind of given, not do much paraphrasing. And you might think that a realist about fictional characters is doing something like this, right? Let's just buy into the existence of Poirot and Columbo and Frodo, and then we have to just take them as having various properties. And that's a way forward. But what's interesting is you have this sort of seesaw. Simple ontology can be offset with a complex ideology. A complex ideology can be offset by a potentially simple ontology. So it's kind of neat, right? You can play this seesaw game, right? Simple ontology, complex ideology, complex ontology, simple ideology. Hey, it's neat. Now, notably, settling how to pick or what kind of balanced option we like best is a very thorny and difficult matter. This is something we can talk about, you might talk about in the methodology class next year. But it's worth noting, while this is an issue, it doesn't necessarily undermine Quine's method. In fact, it kind of suggests that Quine's method is incredibly useful. Quine's method isn't designed to settle, if you remember the joke earlier, disagreements over cases. The tool itself doesn't force a particular answer. It leaves it open, but what it gives you a way to do is figure out where a particular story is going to stand on this sort of balancing act. And discussing these issues is actually a central topic in contemporary metaphysics, in contemporary analytic metaphysics, and certainly in what's often called metametaphysics, or metaphysical methodology. And here you have a kind of dance, right? We construct theories that have more minimal ontological commitments, with skillful paraphrases to kind of capture everyday speech. We then generate some counterexamples to show that the paraphrase doesn't work. which we then kind of find new ways to make the paraphrase work. That leads to more new kind of skillful counterexamples, and thus the dance prolongs. The last kind of problem to talk about is actually a problem for Quine's theory. And this has to do with the key step of regimentation. Right? Remember, regimentation here was our second move. We had kind of settling which sentences a theory takes to be true. Then step 2 was to regiment those sentences into canonical notation, so some kind of formal language. And then step 3 was reading off the commitments that the theory is committed to. Well, the problem here is basically what language counts as canonical notation. Right? This is something we've kind of gestured at already when we thought about our extension of TFL to ML, to modal logic. But if we think about what we might use here, Quine's preferred notation was first-order logic. But there's definitely some things that FOL simply cannot capture. Again, if you want an example, just think about modal claims. Modal claims are not expressible in first-order logic as we've taught it so far. So that means that there's going to be at least one kind of alternative logic to be employed here. More generally, there's going to be a plethora of potential formal languages we can invoke. FOL is one amongst a multitude. And this matters because if you have alternative formulations, alternative ways to express canonical notation, we can challenge Quine and ask, why are we privileging FOL and existential quantification over one of these alternatives? Now, Quine might have an answer, and here we might turn to some deep, dark debates about metalogic and why FOL is so powerful and what other logics might be able to express or not express. But note that Quine needs to answer this question in order to vindicate his methodology, however we want to understand it. So this is an interesting challenge for the Quinean, or anyone who wants to employ Quine's method to catch cheaters to answer our earlier commitment issues. Tell us what we mean by canonical notation. Justify why we're picking a particular formal language over another. Until then, it looks kind of arbitrary. And that's an interesting place to finish. Now, notably, what we've talked about here was one particular philosophical upshot or application of FOL. Right? FOL gives Quine and Quineans a way to kind of recapture or express the ontological commitments of a theory. But this isn't the only kind of interesting philosophical application or upshot of FOL. And our next topic, what we're going to talk about next week, is another instance here. And specifically what we want to talk about is the notion of identity. So if you remember way back in weeks, I'm going to say 5 or 6, we introduced this sort of identity predicate. And identity in FOL was extremely useful. It let us kind of capture a bunch of sentences. We couldn't do without it. But metaphysically, philosophically, identity is weird. And so what we're going to talk about next week is something like kind of interplay between the philosophical notion of identity and the formal notion that we've characterized. We're going to come at it and see, is there any kind of philosophical way we can justify or underpin our formal conception of identity. In order to kind of do that, what I'll ask you to do is read a very brief article from Max Black on the identity of indiscernibles. Love the typo there. And this article kind of tries to motivate reducing or understanding identity in terms of what we call indiscernibility. Black kind of defines that. Notably, there's also a question set available concerning kind of ontological commitment to things in this lecture. That's what we'll talk about this coming Thursday. So yeah, that's what I wanted to cover. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for being flexible about this. Enjoy the protest. And hope to see you this coming week, either at the protest or on Thursday.